Thank you, Harry. I'll just press that. So yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I've just noticed that my title is actually missing a word, palaeoenvironmental, which is a great start. But yeah, so my name is Lucy. I'm a third year PhD student at the University of Liverpool and one of the organisers of the Evolutionary Anthropology webinar series. It's great to talk to you all today about some of the work that I've been doing as part of my PhD. And yeah, so move on to the next. There we go. Yeah, so this work was recently published in Scientific Reports, which was really exciting. The paper itself is open access if anyone wants to read it. And it was co-authored by myself, Matt Grove, who's my supervisor, Andrea Manica from the University of Cambridge, who we've also had talk to us in this series this year, Dr. Stephen Rusina from the National Museums of Kenya, and Jim Bob Blinkhorn, who also gave a talk for us earlier this year. And just to quickly say before I go into it that the code and the data is also openly accessible. So if anybody wants to check it out, it's on the OSF page for the project. There's a link in with the paper, or you can just search the title and it's all available there. So just to quickly go over what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So first of all, I'm going to give a bit of background to Eastern Africa, the Eastern African Middle Stone Age, and why it's sort of so important and significant for understanding the evolution of modern humans. Then I'm going to present the data that we've used to create this spatiotemporally explicit palaeoenvironmental framework. Then I'm going to go through the results. There's a few sort of different bits of analysis that were carried out, and I'm going to discuss sort of each bit as we go along. And then at the end, I'm going to conclude and sort of wrap it all up and explain why this work has been sort of significant and important for understanding the sorts of environments that Eastern African Middle Stone Age populations were inhabiting. Oh, I can't. There we go. Okay, so fossil, archaeological and environmental records, together with the geographic placement of the region, suggests that Eastern Africa played a prominent role in the evolution and dispersal of modern humans. The region has a vastly diverse and unique geography, hydrology, geology and environment, lying at the conjunction of the Arabian, Nubian and Somalian tectonic plates, where movements have created its distinctive volcanic landscapes and rift valleys. Also, it occupies a central position within the African continent, making the region distinctively connected, sort of acting as a corridor for movements of flora and fauna between Saharan Africa, Southwest Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Studies have found that almost all of the major mammalian dispersals within Africa or between Africa and Eurasia have left a trace in the Eastern African fossil record, and it appears that no technological innovation has bypassed the region as hominin populations spread from the continent into Eurasia and vice versa. Also, Eastern Africa has a north to south running coastline and Rift Valley lakes and rivers that drain the region to all fundamental directions. The Eastern African Rift System runs 4,500 kilometers from Southwest Asia to Southeast Africa, preserving a number of freshwater lakes, including Lake Turkana, Lake Victoria, and Lake Malawi, which are drained to the north by the Nile River, to the west by the headwaters of the Congo, and to the south by the Zambezi. The hydrological features of Eastern Africa have important evolutionary implications. So, for example, the distribution of animal populations across the landscape may have been influenced by the cyclical expansion and contraction of the major lakes, which would have divided and reconnected populations and leading to high rates of speciation and instances where parent and daughter species live in the same area. So I really like this schematic from Trout et al. 2010, because it sort of shows how climate likely caused lakes within the Eastern African Rift sort of periodically dry out, which would have connected and allowed populations to meet each other, and then disconnected populations through further drying, which sort of ties into these patterns of structured diversity, as advocated by Eleanor Sherry and colleagues in their 2018 paper. So as I've sort of mentioned, Eastern Africa also has some of the oldest known fossils, which are believed to represent some of the earliest potential members of our own species. So these are the Homo kibish and Hertu fossils from Ethiopia, which were initially dated to around 150 to 200,000 years ago. However, recently the Homo fossils have been redated to 233,000 years ago, which is pretty exciting considering the discovery of the Jebel Uhud fossil in Morocco, which was dated off the top of my head to about 300,000 years ago. So it's sort of pushing back the first appearance datum of sort of our species in different regions. So the Middle Stone Age is the phase most commonly associated with the emergence of our species across Africa. And the Middle Stone Age record of Eastern Africa is particularly rich, largely due to the extensive research history and the preservation conditions of the region. So here are some really pretty and really nice Middle Stone Age points from Homo kibish. The photos were taken by my collaborator, Dr. Bahalu Habte, which are, and these sorts of artifacts are commonly seen throughout the continent for this period. We also see in the Eastern African Middle Stone Age, sort of symbolic behaviours like ostrich eggshell beads and ochre use, as well as an increase in long distance raw material sourcing and evidence for more extensive population networks. So archaeological studies of the Eastern African Middle Stone Age have long proposed a link between the distribution of sites, behavioural diversity and environmental conditions. So Laura Basil, in her paper in 2008, made a key contribution by integrating modelled ecological data with a landmark synthesis of Middle Stone Age assemblages. This highlighted the placement of Middle Stone Age locations near to, but not necessarily within, wooded ecologies, stressing the importance of ecotonal settings for enduring habitability in the region. Tryon and Faith in 2013 made important advances in the quantitative assessment of Eastern African Middle Stone Age lithic composition, though they lacked the means to make similar developments in the characterization of Middle Stone Age environments, and they acknowledged the sort of mismatched geographies and scales of archaeological and environmental records. And then Matt and Jim Bob, in a suite of quantitative analyses, sort of brought together ecology and archaeology using an expanded data set of Middle Stone Age lithic artifact typologies, alongside modern environmental data sets and models for the last glacial maximum and last interglacial. So their results stress the influence of environmental settings over the spatial temporal distribution of Middle Stone Age sites, with pulsed patterns of occupation intensity occurring during interglacial stages. They found significant relationships between raw material and stone tool types, and geographic and environmental variables were reported, with the strongest relationships with topographic roughness, so the sort of heterogeneity of the landscape. So these results sort of validate the emphasis that has been placed on ecology and the physical landscape within the East African Middle Stone Age. But all of these studies have either used modern biogeographic zones to represent Pleistocene environments, or they rely on simulated data sets representing arid, humid extremes both of which lack chronological precision and assume uniformity across successive glacial and interglacial cycles. So now looking at the proxy sort of data, so proxy records have vastly improved in chronological resolution over the past decade and now provide evidence for climatic changes in several major basins spanning the region. So, for example, Lamb and colleagues published a near continuous lake record from Lake Turkana, which demonstrates increased climatic fluctuation towards the end of the penultimate glacial period, followed by abrupt change to stable humid conditions during marine isotope stage 5E to C. This record, from which elemental ratios are used as a proxy for effective moisture, has been used by MAT to assess out of Africa dispersal chronologies. So then at Olorgesailie, high resolution core and leaf wax data has been associated with Acheulean and Middle Stone Age deposits just 24 kilometers away from the drill site, which has allowed for the identification of a period of increased variability coinciding with the origin of the Middle Stone Age. And then finally, the late Pleistocene records from Chubahir Basin, which demonstrate a series of wet to dry transitions of varying amplitude and duration through K counts, with the early modern human fossil site, Homo kibish, lying close to but not within the basin. And this record could potentially offer a climatic context for Middle Stone Age occupations at the site, considering that they find highly favourable humid conditions, which broadly correspond to the new dating of the Homo fossils to around 210 thousand years ago. So despite sort of the improvement in resolution that these proxy studies have presented, paleoclimatic patterns and the records that have been used to generate them are highly diverse and are rooted within a small number of lake basins, often without stratigraphically associated archaeological assemblages. So this makes it complicated to apply them with the widely distributed Middle Stone Age records in the region. So here we've created a composite of different proxy records for the region. Many of them I've just sort of discussed. And you can see that the data that they've used are all highly diverse and in some cases hard to sort of compare. What's more, the lake cores yield data that act as relative wet and dry proxies, and translating these into tangible climatic or ecological parameters to represent exactly how wet or how dry is challenging. So overall, whilst the region yields relatively rich archaeological and climatic records, there are substantial disconnects between them, which makes understanding and quantifying the influence of environments on early modern human behaviour very difficult. So our research has attempted to provide an integration of climate and archaeology of the Eastern African Middle Stone Age within a spatiotemporally explicit paleoenvironmental framework. So we've used new high resolution climate simulations from a new statistical climate emulation published by the Evolutionary Ecology Group at the University of Cambridge, which are now free to download and use. So these simulations cover the last 800,000 years at 1,000 year time intervals, and there's a range of bioclimatic variables available. I think there's 17 in total, but for our study, we extracted mean annual temperature and total annual precipitation due to their sort of combined impact on the sort of flora and fauna on the ground. And also we've extracted the biome reconstruction from the model. We extracted the values from the 1,000 year time slice representative of the middle of each assemblage's date range as a simple estimate of chronology. So there have been some studies that have permuted across the date ranges, and they found that strong relationships are retained when under these permutation tests. So we think that the use of the mid-age should be sufficient. So we extracted all of the values within a 50-kilometer radius around the coordinates of each site, of each occupation, representative of the population's home range, given what we know from ethnographic studies of hunter-gatherer mobility and localized raw material procurement patterns. So we thought this was the most appropriate approach, given that this gives us an idea of the climatic conditions of the whole landscape that the hominins were situated within. So there, we had 84 dated assemblages in total, which have been published by Matt and Jim Bob in a separate paper in Archaeological and Anthropological Sciences. Some sites have multiple assemblages, and so when these assemblages have been dated to different time periods, we were able to look at how the environments varied both within and between sites across space and time. So within this data set, there was also information regarding the presence or absence of 16 tool types and 8 raw materials. So in the middle, you've got all the assemblages, and then here you've got the presence or absence of the tool types and the raw material types. Jim, Bob and Matt also recorded some other sites characteristics like altitude, topographic roughness, whether the site was a cave site or a open air site. But the use of this archaeological data sort of provides us with a representation of toolkit composition and raw material usage, which we could test with the climatic variables. So from integrating the assemblages with the climate model, we found that the occupations tend to occur in subhumid climates. So we performed a cluster analysis to help highlight some of the patterns, and we used an automated clustering algorithm to determine how many clusters there are in the data, and it found 10 clusters. So it's quite interesting that there's some sort of spatial structure to the clusters. So for example, all the Pangaea Saidi occupations clustered together, and the Lake Victoria Island assemblages cluster together at the bottom. There was also an assemblage which clusters on its own, as it occupies a uniquely hot and dry environment. But sort of from this, you can also see that most of the assemblages are dominated by tropical xerophytic shrubland environments in yellow, where, however, interestingly, there are 2 cold clusters, so cluster 8 and cluster 9, where we don't see this biome at all. So cluster 9 especially is the coldest group of assemblages, and they occupy very diverse landscapes, as all of the assemblages are found at high altitude within the Ethiopian and Kenyan rift, where the complex topography allows diverse biomes to occur closer together than on flatter terrain. So then we superimposed our data onto the composite to sort of demonstrate the diachronic patterns. So here the grey blocks are the interglacial phases, and the white blocks are the glacials. So you can see the pattern that Jim, Bob and Matt already outlined, that there are pulses of occupation during interglacial phases, which aren't to do with preservation biases, as they occur even in the older interglacial phases. So due to the small number of occupations in glacial phases, we've focused really on interpreting the more numerous interglacial phases. So during marine isotope stage 7, we found a dramatic increase in the diversity of environments occupied compared to MIS 8 and 9, with an emphasis on forest and wooded ecotones and tropical xerophytic shrubland. Then MIS5 was marked by another phase of expansion, though this was limited, though this saw a limited presence in woodland habitats and typically warmer, drier and lower altitude occupations. And then alternatively in MIS3, there was a push into higher precipitation woodland habitats with a limited change in temperature and altitude. So then we asked whether the environmental changes at the occupations that we're seeing, whether this reflects shifts in the underlying ecology or whether they actually reflect shifts in habitat preferences. So here we're looking at the proportions of the biomes available throughout the middle to late Pleistocene, the time slices where we have Middle Stone Age occupations present, and then MIS3, MIS5 and MIS7. So the bars represent the proportions of the different biomes. So you can see that they're all very similar, but using a chi-square test to statistically compare them, we found that the relative proportions of each biome available across the landscape did not change significantly between marine isotope stage, suggesting that any changes in the biomes occupied does reflect a shift in preference. So then we compared this with the proportions of biomes found at Middle Stone Age occupations, which is the line drawn on top. So as you can see, we found that the proportion of sites with access to woodland biomes is much higher than is generally found across the landscape. So that's these here, particularly in MIS3 and MIS7. Interestingly, we also found that all of the sites without access to tropical xerophytic shrubland, which is in yellow, were ecotonal. So they occupied the boundaries between multiple, often wooded biome types. And that engagement with new biomes tended to occur on the periphery of the home range. So altogether, this supports the earlier work by Laura Basil that when expanding beyond the widespread and widely occupied shrubland settings, populations preferred the rarer areas with access to a diverse range of wooded resources that allowed them to sustain themselves. So we also found that the proportion of sites with access to tropical xerophytic shrubland is slightly higher than that found across the landscape, even though this biome type is the most predominant in the underlying ecology, suggesting that Eastern African Middle Stone Age adaptive strategies were centered around engaging with subsistence resources associated with this biome. So here are some photos taken by my co-author, Dr. Stephen Rusina, of modern xerophytic environments in Eastern Africa today. So you can see the sorts of landscapes that these populations would have been occupying. So looking at a quick case study of one of the occupations. So the youngest Middle Stone Age assemblage at Panga Usaidi is dated to around 73,000 years ago. And we've placed it at a unique tropical ecotone between tropical deciduous forest, tropical savanna, and tropical xerophytic shrubland. So some of you may remember we had a talk by Dr. Emmanuel Ndiema a few months ago from the National Museums of Kenya about this site, and sort of the Middle Stone Age occupation at the end of MIS5 is rapidly followed by cultural change at Panga Usaidi, with the appearance of the later Stone Age occurring here earlier than anywhere else in the region. So these new constellations of tools within MIS5 toolkits could suggest corresponding changes in behaviour previously unseen in the Middle Stone Age, which perhaps may have been key for these expansions beyond tropical xerophytic shrubland into new tropical ecotonal landscapes. Together, this could suggest that certain Middle Stone Age toolkits may have led to environmental adaptation, as opposed to adaptations being a prerequisite for expansion, with transient ecotonal habitats requiring the adoption of a range of survival strategies and potentially mediating interaction between different groups across different environmental contexts. So next, we produced phased habitability models to map the extent of the climates inhabited by Eastern African Middle Stone Age assemblages. So to do this, we grouped the occupations into the more abundant interglacial marine isotope stages, and then the climatic range, or the climatic envelope, if you will, was produced for each phased subset, and then we projected it throughout each 1,000-year time interval for that marine isotope stage. And then we calculated the percentage of habitable cells, so the cells that remained within the climatic envelope, to essentially identify areas that were persistently habitable, as well as the geographic range and temporal scope of impersistent habitable landscapes. So here we're looking at the habitability models for precipitation in blue, temperature in red, and both of them combined in green. And the colour scale represents the percentage of cells that remain habitable within that time period. So these models fundamentally show that interglacial Middle Stone Age occupations, especially in MIS5, may have been much more spatially diverse than is presently known. Our models also suggest that expansions during earlier phases tended to be constrained by the available precipitation across the landscape. So for MIS5 and MIS7, the precipitation habitability is much more spatially limited than the temperature one, whereas in MIS3, the temperature habitability model is more spatially limiting than the precipitation model, suggesting that temperature may have been more limiting over where Middle Stone Age populations were living during this interglacial. MIS3 includes some very hot periods, and we found that occupations tend to be limited to cooler, higher altitude regions. So perhaps this could be to mitigate these rapid increases in temperature. So as you can see, sort of this region towards the east of Lake Victoria remains habitable throughout all of our models, and throughout all the interglacials, we always have occupations from around this area. And this has potentially important implications for it as a refugia during climatic deterioration. So this region is marked by a fluctuating ecotone between tropical xerophytic shrubland and various forested woodland biomes. Lake Victoria experiences a similar environment today, where it forms an important boundary for large mammal and human populations in the Central African forests and the savanna of Eastern Africa. The availability of fresh water provided by surrounding rivers and springs, and the complex topography of the Rift Valley may also have helped buffer against the strongest effects of climate change in the area. Occupying refugia likely required minimal cultural adaptation to environmental change, which could explain why assemblages from within the Lake Victoria basin show distinct differences from the general Eastern African Middle Stone Age. Also, Lake Victoria is the source of the White Nile, and therefore its refugial position could also have interesting implications for dispersals from the region out of the continent. So together, this highlights the potential role of refugia in structuring Middle Stone Age human, cultural, and biological diversity. So our identification of the region to the east of Lake Victoria as an ecotonal refugia was confirmed by another paper that has recently been published in Philosophical Transactions B, which explored African refugia during the late Pleistocene. So this map on the left marks the frequency of change through time. So with sort of the greeny khaki cells being quicker change, and the purple cells being no change. And then the middle map shows whether an area is a stable forest, a changing forest, a changing open landscape, or a stable open landscape. And then the map on the right shows whether the area is sort of homogeneous and has low variability, or is an impersistent ecotone, or is a persistent ecotone. So this study was done using the same climate simulations as the main study that I'm presenting today. So the area to the east of Lake Victoria, so where we find the most archaeological occupations, is generally marked by environments that change sort of every 5 to 20,000 years, with changing forests and open environments and persistent and impersistent ecotones. So overall in this study, we identified that Eastern African hominin occupations within homogeneous and stable biomes were pretty rare, with the majority of occupations associated with more variable habitats. Spatial and temporal variability are frequently suggested to elicit distinctive evolutionary responses. So many theoretical models associate spatial variability with the emergence of generalism, and temporal variability with the evolution of behavioural or phenotypic plasticity. Plasticity has been argued to have been vital for late Pleistocene dispersals, both within and beyond Africa, probably buffering populations against rapid habitat disturbance during periods of increased environmental fluctuation, while also encouraging the development of new adaptations, which helped to facilitate the occupation of new landscapes during periods of less perturbation. So variability selection, as originally coined by Rick Potts, who we also had give a webinar for us last year. So his theories described the evolution of plasticity in the face of climate variability. And this is one of the major hypotheses regarding the emergence of Homo sapiens, which was born from observations that Middle Stone Age innovations are first seen in Eastern Africa during periods of dramatic environmental change. So addressing these issues is becoming increasingly pertinent to research in evolutionary anthropology, but it is difficult by the use of single or even multiple geographically specific core records. So our use of modelled data sets, both in the scientific reports paper and in this Refugia study, have allowed us to characterise both the geographical and chronological extent of environments inhabited by East African populations, as well as their variability. And variability may be particularly important in future studies of late Pleistocene hominin adaptive and dispersal patterns, especially considering that we found that many sites were located in areas of strong habitat change. So finally, to assess whether temperature and precipitation have an influence over the diversity seen in Eastern African Middle Stone Age toolkits, we performed some multiple matrix regressions. So these were done using the other variables in the dataset, which were analysed in the original paper by Matt and Jim Bob. However, here we have updated the climatic variables with the output from our analysis to represent the environments of each assemblage. So you can see that raw material and toolkit composition are tightly linked, having a highly significant relationship. For toolkit composition, we found that site type, so whether a site was open air or a cave site, and topographic roughness had a significant impact on toolkit composition, which kind of makes sense as they both likely required sort of different behavioural adaptations. However, most importantly, we found that precipitation, but not temperature, has a statistically significant relationship with toolkit composition. So this relationship between the archaeology and precipitation was overlooked by the initial results of Matt and Jim Bob, where they used arid, humid extremes and modern model data sets to characterize paleo environments. So this again sort of demonstrates the power of using time-specific climate simulations. A relationship with precipitation kind of makes sense because it's widely known to be a key parameter affecting adaptive strategies due to its impact on the suitability of the environment for habitation and therefore the behavioural adaptations required. So raw material use had a strong relationship with toolkit composition, chronology, cost path, which is a measure of how far the occupations are away from each other if one was to walk in between them, topographic roughness, and an almost statistically significant relationship with precipitation. So overall, this constellation of sort of geographic variables could suggest a complex combination of spatial autocorrelation, which was likely grounded in the uneven availability of raw materials across Eastern Africa, as well as their accessibility in different landscape settings, such as mountains. So these multiple matrix regression results demonstrate that precipitation has a significant independent effect on toolkit composition. So we decided to examine this further to look at the presences and absences of individual technologies by a binary logistic regression. So this table looks a bit scary, but it basically shows that the statistically significant relationships and the direction of the effects between the individual tool types along the top and the other variables in the data set, whilst controlling for all other factors. So this shows that statistically significant decreases in the probability of backed microliths, borers, centripetal technology, platform cores, and scrapers occur in assemblages as precipitation levels decrease after controlling for all other variables in the analysis. So some of these tool types have been found to be significant indicators of either later Stone Age or Middle Stone Age toolkits. So this could sort of suggest a link to changes in precipitation and the development of the later Stone Age. We also found that roughness has a significant impact on toolkit composition, with these further analysis demonstrating that the probability of backed microliths and points, both components of projectile technology associated with hunting of grassland species in flatter landscapes, as the energetic demands of the environment, these decrease as the energetic demands of the environment increase, which sort of makes archaeological sense. So further analysis of the site type variable demonstrates it has significant effects on the probability of backed microliths, bipolar technology, and Levallois flakes appearing in assemblages, with all these technologies occurring more frequently in cave or rock shelter sites. And then finally, there are numerous independent effects of the use of particular raw materials on the presence of individual technologies in the assemblages. So overall, these results demonstrate a complex interaction between the environment and Middle Stone Age behaviour, with the energetic requirements of the physical landscape and local precipitation regimes likely requiring different constellations of tools from the Middle Stone Age toolkit. So in sort of summary and conclusion, our application of high resolution palaeoenvironmental reconstructions has enabled a previously impossible characterization of the ecosystems inhabited by early human populations at this scale, with existing site-based palaeoenvironmental reconstructions very useful, but difficult to integrate and translate into a comprehensive framework for the region. So whilst the application of high resolution climatic simulations to archaeological data is inherently limited by uncertainty surrounding radiometric dates, however, there's work being done to sort of address the effects of dating error on conclusions derived from climatic models. Our results are important for demonstrating that the environmental conditions inhabited throughout the East African Middle Stone Age, with levels of diversity far beyond that typically assumed by sort of classic habitat-specific hypotheses. So by establishing the role of shifting environmental conditions and ecological boundaries on the distribution and variability of dated Middle Stone Age assemblages, our work also helps to illuminate some of the processes that have shaped behavioural diversity during this key period, such as that Middle Stone Age toolkits likely facilitated expansions into diverse environments, adding further complexity to within region migration than simple environment tracking. So understanding this complex interaction between population dynamics, dispersals, cultural evolution, and the environment is also key to moving beyond simplistic single origin models in favour of more complex reticulate models for recent human evolution. So that is the end of my talk. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Just like to thank the co-authors on the study, Also my funding body for supporting my PhD, the AHRC, the developers of the climate data at the University of Cambridge, my supervisors, and also John Gowlett for looking at sort of drafts of the manuscript. So yeah, thank you very much.
Amazing, excellent, really interesting stuff. Thank you for doing that, Lucy. Clearly it was a lot of work, so it's nice to have someone walk all the way through it like that. Amazing stuff. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask Lucy? We don't have any in the chat so far. Larry, are you?
Yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Thank you, Lucy. That was really useful synthesis and analysis. There's a lot there to unpick, so I look forward to reading it. Yeah. I've got I guess there's confusion, but also an observation or a bit more information I'd like. The confusion in the first part, you talked about what appeared to be stability and habitat preference for these dry shrublands, the xerophytic, tropical xerophytic areas, and then if populations range beyond, they'd look for woodland habitats, which they seem pretty well adapted. Then you seem to shift to diversity of habitats as a feature of what was emerging from the data. So I think the first part and the second part left me wondering, within stability, is there diversity? Is that the best way of seeing that? And
yeah.
And just an observation when I remember, I was thinking about the pictures you showed from Kenya. These habitats today are heavily grazed by cattle, sheep, goats, etc. So they would have been even richer in terms of variety and density of plant species and animal species. So I guess that's a question or a suggestion, and maybe looking into the paleoenvironmental record rather than the more recent habitat data might give that extra richness.
Yeah. So we included those sort of images really to sort of visually show what these environments sort of could have been like, really. It was more kind of, it wasn't to say this is what they were like, but more just this is what is there today, and these are the sorts of plants that are there and could have been in the past. So it's more sort of a visual rather than sort of saying what's there today is the same as the past, if that makes sense. In terms of what you're saying about the so our findings, we found that so we took the values from within the 50 kilometers around each site, and what we found was that most of the occupations had access to tropical xerophytic shrubland. So it was, almost all of them had access to that biome, but that within the 50 kilometers, there was also access to a lot of other environments. So that the sort of the ecotonal environments and the woodlands and stuff. So whilst we sort of saw this preference, well, I mean, the tropical xerophytic shrubland environments, you could see by the bar charts, they're the most prevalent biome across the landscape. So it's kind of almost, it'd be weird if that wasn't the most prevalent biome type at the occupations, because it's so widely spread. But what we've kind of found is that they are occupying those rarer areas where there are multiple biome types. I hope that sort of answers your
I think that so there's diversity in the kind of stability of the general habitat. Harry, can I ask one more question? And then is that right? Thank you. And I can see the questions in the chat. Actually, it's an observation. Could you say a little bit more about the assemblage around Lake Victoria? Because you have the stability there, and you mentioned that the technology there, it separates from everywhere else.
Yes. So there's kind of a different signal around the sort of the east of the Lake Victoria Basin. So I think it was Christian Tryon found that the assemblages are quite distinct from the surrounding assemblages. Off the top of my head, I'm not actually sure within our data set if we found a signal that they were different, but yeah, basically that region is sort of consistently occupied throughout the entire period. So we've sort of thought that perhaps this could be, if it's a refugia and sort of requiring different sort of adaptation and different needs than other regions, then this could sort of explain why sort of other studies are picking up that there's a different signal in this area.
Okay. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Larry. We've got a question from Walter in the chat. Walter's asking, can some of your data be used to explain, at least in part, the human migrations we are seeing today?
I'm not sure about migrations today because, well, the climate data that we're using is their sort of climate reconstructions of the past. So, yeah, so I'm not sure if they could be used to explain migrations today.
Yeah, I see that as well. We do have another one from, forgive me if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, Semenu. Thanks, it's an interesting talk. What is the constraints of the simulation modeling in relation to palaeoenvironmental and paleoclimatic reconstruction? And can this approach also be applied to the earlier hominin evolutionary context?
Yeah, so there are some limitations of using sort of paleoclimatic simulations. So one being that so the resolution is 0.5 degrees, which is about sort of 50 kilometers. So you're kind of getting that sort of coarse account of variability without downscaling. And also the constraints of using sort of these high resolution models with archaeological data is obviously the archaeology has there's big date ranges in some instances. There's some limitations there. In terms of being applied to earlier hominin evolutionary contexts, I know these simulations go back to 800,000 years ago. I think other studies have recently published on sort of doing climate envelope modeling for even earlier contexts, so like 2 million years ago. So yeah, I guess there's always it's always going to be a prediction of the environment rather than sort of a reconstruction from a proxy, which is giving you yeah, sort of different types of data.
Excellent. Thanks for that question. John, would you like to go ahead and ask a question?
Oh, yeah.
Hi, John.
Hi, Lucy. Great. I'm just trying to think of a sensible question. And I sometimes think that we might exaggerate the importance of the Rift Valley simply because of the lakes and the sediments, and we all look at it. Have you any thoughts on that?
I mean, there's certainly, like, you can see why we do have a lot of occupations from these areas. I mean, also, I think it is research history a lot of the time as well. So you kind of have that bias in the background. But in terms of what the area sort of offers, like you do have, yeah, the complex topography can sort of provide buffers against the effects of different climate events. You do have the water availability, which is obviously vital for survival. So yeah, I think in my head I can sort of see why there is a focus on the Rift sort of Valley. But yeah, I guess it is partially to do with the research bias, because everybody's been, well, not everybody, but a lot of research has gone on there. So
yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Excellent, thanks, John. Matt, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Harry. So again, this is just expanding on also the sort of thing that Larry picked up on about this Lake Victoria region, because I think some of the things that Christian's pointed out are things like, there are lots of endemic fossil fauna there. The obsidian seems to be moving in a slightly different way. The transition to the LSA is much later, and you don't get things like ostrich eggshell beads until the Holocene in that region. So the interesting thing is whether, when people talk about Refugia, they sort of go for highland areas normally. They'll say something like the southwest Ethiopian plateau or something. But that's potentially a sort of lowland Refugia. And I just wonder if you could say anything more about why you think that might be different. So is it something like, are we actually getting kind of stagnation in Refugia and then innovation when people spread out? Or, what is it about that region coming out of this? And do you think there's anything you can sort of muse on about that?
Yeah, I mean, good question. Yeah, I mean, it is certainly coming up as being sort of an important region. And I think when it comes to Refugia, we kind of always say Refugia, but we haven't really sort of defined what a Refugia actually is. And I think that's one thing that came out of the Phil Trans B paper, is that sort of Refugia can be defined by variability, and it might actually be that variability which makes it a good place to live, because you have that diverse access to diverse resources, and yeah, you have sort of the availability of fresh water, like I sort of said, and yeah, I think we kind of really need to think about what actually constitutes a Refugia, which I think that paper sort of addresses quite well. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that we need to look at actually in more detail, maybe.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thanks, Matt. Thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks, Matt.
Any questions from anybody else? Any questions from the chat at all? Or should we let Lucy go?
Yes.
That looks about it then, Lucy. Thanks very much for doing this. Amazing. Really good stuff.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for coming. Join us next week, and we've got another talk. It'll be amazing as well. Thanks very much. See you all later.
Yeah, thanks everyone.